Okay, looks like we are live. Welcome, everybody, to Standing for Truth. I am your host, Donny, and I want to thank you all for being here for tonight's very important program. We at Standing for Truth are dedicated to defending the truth of biblical creation. We also host debates, interviews, lectures, and more. And so if you enjoy this content, please make sure to hit that subscribe button. And please share around this content as the truth is so incredibly important. One of the many ways we defend the truth of biblical creation is by inviting and hosting some really awesome guests on this program. And today we have a very special guest, as it is a privilege and an honor to have Dr. Jerry Bergman here with me today for, again, a very important show. Dr. Bergman, thank you so much for giving us your time for today's exciting program.
It's great to be here.
I appreciate it. And to be more specific, we are dealing with human evolution. And Dr. Bergman's presentation tonight is titled Apes as Ancestors. And we will also be having an audience question and answer immediately following this presentation. So we do want to make this program interactive. And so just please make sure you are tagging me with your questions. I know our live chats tend to get pretty wild, and I do appreciate how you guys are so engaged in these important topics. So again, just make sure you're tagging me at Standing for Truth, and that way I won't miss your questions. Now, before we get into Dr. Bergman's presentation here, I do want to give our guest tonight an appropriate introduction. So Dr. Jerry Bergman has taught biology, genetics, chemistry, biochemistry, anthropology, geology, and microbiology for over 40 years at several colleges and universities, including Bowling Green State University, Medical College of Ohio, where he was a research associate in experimental pathology, and the University of Toledo. He is a graduate of the Medical College of Ohio, Wayne State University in Detroit, the University of Toledo, and Bowling Green State University. He has over 1,300 publications in 12 languages and 40 books and monographs. His books and textbooks that include chapters that he authored are in over 1,500 college libraries in 27 countries. So far, over 80,000 copies of the 40 books and monographs that he has authored or co-authored are in print. Now, I do have various links in the description box of this video, ladies and gentlemen, where you can find more about Dr. Bergman, including his many must-read articles that he has written. Dr. Bergman, that's a very impressive resume, and I'm just glad that we're on the same team and same side here, brother.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I appreciate it. Okay, so that being said, Dr. Bergman, we're going to hand it over to you so we can get right into the presentation. And the floor is yours, Jerry.
Okay. Good to be here. Get this to work. Still trying to get it to work here.
Yeah, no worries. I could certainly guide you as well. Oh, I see it popping up right now. And there we go. We can see your screen currently, Dr. Bergman.
Now, do you need to see the whole thing?
Nope, we just need to see the PowerPoint slides themselves. So you're not going to be able to see us. You'll just see your own PowerPoints presentation, but us in the audience and me as host will be able to see everything.
Okay, so this is about apes as ancestors. And
actually, Jerry, if I could stop you, I currently see two windows. Have you clicked the PowerPoint itself presentation?
Okay, let me.
Yeah, there you go. And then you might want to make that full screen.
Okay.
And also one last recommendation before you start. If you see that little box there, you might want to click hide just so.
Hide, okay.
Yes, you got it.
Okay, I'm good now.
No, well, almost. And just make sure you click your PowerPoint because we can still see, the little StreamYard window here that's blocking your PowerPoint.
Okay.
Now we're good.
Okay. This is based on Genesis 1:27, a real simple scripture. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created he, him, male and female, he created he, them, from the King James Version. I'm just getting over a cold, so I've got a scratchy throat, but we'll get through it. And this is really the heart of creation, humans. We don't really worry too much about the creation of snails or pollywogs. We're concerned about primarily the creation of human beings. And ironically, there hasn't been that much consideration of this issue among creationists. And a good example is this book, Apes as Ancestors, which I recently completed with Peter Line and Jeff Tompkins and Daniel Biddle. And what we tried to do was evaluate the literature about human evolution. And to do that, we looked at the paleontological literature to try to find out what they had to say. There's a lot of debate about this. For example, in Christianity Today, a cover story talked about the search for historical Adam. And this magazine basically concluded that there is a falling away of the belief in the historical Adam. And the problem with that is, of course, from a Christian standpoint, is that the whole New Testament is based on the fact that Adam and Eve were created. Adam sinned, sin entered into the world, and as a result, a sacrifice of Christ on the cross was necessary to negate that sin which all humans inherited. And so if there's no Adam and no Eve, it is the foundation of Christianity is decimated. The most famous example is Lucy, and there's a lot of examples in museums. The one you see here, one is in Cleveland Museum, and the other is in the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. And you'll notice that one looks like a male, the other looks like a female. Well, Lucy was the most famous by far example of human evolutionary link. And the problem with that is they don't know if it was a male or female. They don't have enough body parts, skeleton parts to determine what sex it is. She was named Lucy because while they were digging up the bones, the song Lucy in the Sky was playing, and they thought, well, that sounds like a good name. So they named her Lucy. The second thing you'll notice is that these two likenesses of Lucy are really very, very different. And that's pretty obvious from these pictures here that it's a guess. And in a minute, I'll show you the bones that they actually found, which is not that many, although it's recognized as the most complete fossil skeleton we have to date of historical link between man and apes. Let me get a drink of water here. That should help. At any rate, so we looked at the literature for Lucy primarily because this is the most famous example. In my book, we also looked at not just Lucy, but we looked at all the examples. And how we did the book was we had a claim by a certain person about a missing link. And that claim was typically criticized by other evolutionists who had their own claim for a missing link. And basically, each paleontologist criticized the others. And as a result, we took all of the criticism and tried to evaluate which indeed claim had the most evidence. And we found indeed all of them were severely problematic. Even Lucy, which is the most well-known example, and that's why I looked at this example. Now, when you look at religious differences in the belief between creation of Adam and Eve and the example of, in this case, whether evolution is the best place for the best explanation for the origin of human life on Earth. And you'll find these are those who accept human evolution. Ironically, the lowest percent was Jehovah's Witnesses. The second low was Mormons. The third low is evangelical Protestants, which would be many Baptist and similar denominations. Then historical Black Protestants, 38% accept the belief of Adam and Eve. And you can see we go all the way up to the Buddhist, Hindu, and Jews. And we can see that the vast majority, the longer the line, that means the more people accept human evolution as the best explanation for the origin of human life on Earth. And so we can see even among various religious denominations, a very high percent accept evolution as the origin of man and not creation. And the next slide, it doesn't take a genius to realize that there's a huge difference. And we can see a little boy on one side and a monkey on the other side. And we can see just by the facial examples, there are enormous differences. And I selected this article because it said, this is from National Geographic, it said the DNA profiles of these two are nearly 99% the same. Well, this is simply not true. And this has been known not to be not true for years. The difference actually is about 500 million base pair differences. In other words, there's an enormous difference between human DNA, and chimp DNA, which should be obvious from looking at the facial features, the faces of these two individuals. It's not 99% similar, but it's close to 500 million bases difference, which is a huge DNA difference. You wonder, why in the world do they state this something that's been wrong for decades? I don't know any reputable geneticist that would make this claim at all today. Well, it takes a while to get the information out to the public, and many people who write these articles, like for National Geographic, are not typically professional paleontologists, but they are individuals who are writers, who are authors, and they pick what they learn in somewhere and repeat information which is not, in this case, not true. But even among creationists, there's a disagreement about various specimens that they claim are missing links between us and apes. So we tried to examine carefully the data and summarize what it said. And here is 2 books about Lucy, and it's considered an amazing story, and it is the beginning of humankind, according to the book title here, and also is one of the most famous discoveries and the most important missing link, so to speak, between us and the chimps. Now, what did they actually find? Well, hopefully you can see the picture there. What's brown would be the bones they found, and the white would be what was added. So you can see the majority of the skeleton was added. In fact, you really don't even have a half of a side proper. About 20% of the skeleton was found. And this is one of the most complete Australopithecus skeletons ever found. And so we're talking about the most complete. That among the most complete, there's one more they claim is more complete, but you can see that there's a lot missing. So of the 47, they found 47 bones. There's 207 in humans and 47 of 207. And of the 47, most were small fragments. And so they have a lot of fragments. Therefore, there's a lot of guesswork that was required in order to determine what Lucy was like. There you can see another picture of her. This one, they picture her as a female. And then you see the bones they found. And again, it's pretty pathetic. And technically, this is Australopithecus afarensis. And these bones were found in Ethiopia. And I'm not sure how many models there are, but I know there are at least 100 or more in the world which display Lucy. And some background between the footprints were found. And of course, they found no hands or feet on Lucy. Therefore, they have to assume what they were like. One way of assuming is they found in 1976 some hominid footprints in Laetoli, which is a province in Tanzania. And they concluded that these belonged to Lucy. Well, they were wanting to find proof, and so here they've got some footprints. So let's look at these footprints. And we can see a human footprint on one side and a ape footprint on the other side. Actually, if you think about it, look carefully, humans have 2 feet and 2 hands. Apes, on the other hand, really have 4 hands. And this is very useful if you want to climb a tree. And to climb a tree, which most all apes are tree dwelling, and therefore, if you want to climb a tree, you need to have a hand, 4 hands to get up the tree. Humans have a hard time climbing trees because they only have 2 hands to pull themselves up. And you can see a huge difference between in this case, the feet of the apes and the feet of a human. Well, that's the footprints they found. And obviously that is the footprint of a human, not of an ape. And so they claim that Lucy and her kind had human feet and human hands. But of course, they have no direct evidence of that. And here you can see the footprints in more detail in ash. And the footprints, the one I showed you, was the best they found. So many of the rest are not as good. And here's a picture drawn from those footprints. And you'll notice how very human the bodies are and how very ape-like the heads are. And this is common in these pictures of ape men. They show very human bodies and very ape-like heads. And that's because the evidence we have, the bone evidence primarily, is very scant. And the total of 69 prints were found, and 2 adults and a child they think were found. And these were found 1,000 miles from the Lucy bones. So they conclude it may not have been Lucy's close type, but Lucy's basic type. And from these footprints, it's clear they were likely human. In fact, a number of people have said they look exactly like the footprints you would find today at a beach of someone not wearing shoes. And indeed, they look as such. My conclusion is that they are simply human footprints and have nothing to do with Lucy or any other claimed human ancestor. And in 2016, they found some more. In fact, these were surrounded by modern mammals and birds, which indicates that they were modern humans, because indeed we find evidence of the surrounding animals were, as far as we can tell, modern mammals and birds. Some scholars conclude, and I think with good reason, that these footprints were actually the footprints of the local people. Now, they may be quite old. It's hard to date them because they can't date when the footprints were made. They can date, though, when the ash was put down to some degree. And so there's a problem in dating the ash and assuming the footprints were put on that ash at the time the ash was laid down. So that's a problem. It's one of many problems. And then in 76, they found even more examples. And now the footprints they found are evidence of a 5 feet 9 inch person. And if we look at one of the pictures of Lucy in a museum compared to a modern human, we can see Lucy was a very short animal, around 3.5 and 4 feet tall, less than 5 feet tall. And so, again, that's evidence that those prints were from a modern human, because the print impressions appear to be made by a human that was about 5'9", 5'10" inches tall, 5 feet 9, 10 inches tall. Another aspect they're looking at, because to prove that Lucy was our human ancestor, there is a need to prove that she walked upright. And the problem is upright walking is very different from bipedal walking, which of course is what humans do. And we can see the pictures here show the differences in the muscle and bone structure of an ape, and even an ape walking upright or attempting to, and humans. So when we look at these various body structures, we find something interesting. The first thing we'll look at is the skull, and then we'll look at the upright walking traits. The skull you can see in this picture here is a few small fragments of bone, and you see a large amount is filled in by the investigator. And these fragments here, judging by the fragments that are there, and if we look especially at the temple area, they indicate they are from not an ape-like person, but an ape, period, which is what I conclude Lucy was, simply another ape. And this evidence supports in that direction. When you take an artist's interpretation of the face, you can see that, and there are many more examples, but I couldn't find them, but you can see 3 different examples of the artist's drawing from the bones that are found, and you can see how different these are, especially the one in between the other 2. And here again, we see the Lucy walking from what we conclude, given she was an ape. And the other slide, you can see the green. The green are actually the body parts that we found. And so you can see we don't really have an adequate number of body parts to determine that indeed she walked regularly on 2 feet. And then this you can see is relatives of Lucy. And for our study, we looked at all of these different relatives and found the same problems with all of them. But for now, we're focusing on Lucy. And so conclusion, just so far, we found that we have apes and we have humans, and we have 0 good evidence in between apes and humans. And of course, this is a result of my study in looking at the evidence for the fossil record for evolution from apes to humans. Now, again, if you talk to individual paleontologists, they would say, well, I think I have a lot of case for my theory. But the critics then criticized my theory. And so we looked at the criticism and found in most cases it was valid. And then we also looked at the claims by others and found the same thing is true. And a good example, if I can get some liquid here. For coffee all night, I'm doing pretty good. I just went to Indianapolis and did 4 presentations and ended up with a head cold for my trip to Indianapolis. But anyway, you can see now the skeletons of an ape and a human. You can see how enormously different they are. And therefore, you are looking for these differences when you find skeletons of supposed ape men. And of course, the problem is, in most cases, all we find is fragments, and therefore there's a lot of speculation and guesswork that fills in the details. And here we can see primates from my left, in the middle, Australopithecus, and then Homo sapiens. So you can see from the skulls, they are very different. And one reason they're different is because humans walk upright on 2 feet bipedal, and apes, of course, walk on all 4s. And this is going to produce some differences in the place where the spinal cord goes into the brain. And we can see that area by looking at the skeletons itself and the foramen magnum, which means big hole, basically. And you can see in A, orangutan, B, a male gorilla, C, a female gorilla, D, a chimp, and E, a human. Well, human, you cannot even see this because the 4 examples of apes that we look at all walked on all 4s. Human walk bipedally. Therefore, the foramen magnum was at a different place. And when we look at the bottom of each of the skulls, we can see now the placement of the foramen magnum in all 4 examples compared to humans. And this dynamically shows the difference between this. So when you're looking at skulls, a key thing to look at is the location of this foramen magnum, which they did on Lucy. And of course, from what evidence we have, which is not much because there's not many skull pieces we used, indicates she was an ape. A major difference, too, between apes and humans is the brain size. The average human has 1378 gram brain size. The average chimp brain size is 399 grams. And when we compare that, we can see the top line is a human, the next gorilla, which is closest to us, the next orangutan, and then chimp. And so you can see really a very dramatic difference between humans and apes. When we look at Lucy's brain size, from what we can determine, it was close to a chimpanzee, considerably less than a human. And this shows you the same data charted in a different way to emphasize the difference between human brains and chimp brains. Other differences are the internal ear. Since humans walk upright, the ear has to be designed differently so that they can walk upright without getting dizzy, and apes likewise, so they can walk on all fours without getting dizzy. And when we look at the evidence we have, which is scanty, it indicates that Lucy was a chimp. A dramatic difference, which is, of course, you can't tell from looking at the skeleton, but you can certainly tell in the models that are built into various areas in the museums, especially. And one of the most dramatic differences is the whites of the eyes. The top picture, you can very clearly see the whites of the eyes. And in the picture below, you can clearly see there is no evidence of whites of the eyes. And almost all, there's one minor exception, but almost all apes, you cannot see the whites of the eyes. But yet the mannequins they show in museums of Lucy, you can see the whites of the eyes. Again, they're trying to make Lucy look more like a modern human and not what she probably looked like, and that is a chimp. And there we can see the skeletal designs for the hip area, the iliad, the sacrum, and so on. For a walker on 4 legs is very different than a human, which walks on 2 legs. The design is very different. From what evidence we have, the design is closest, and again, it's fragmented, but it's closest to a chimp. And there you can see actually the chimp walking around, and you can see that the bones of Lucy are placed to some degree to give you an illustration of indeed the long hip with flat iliac blades is what they find evidence for in Lucy. And there you can see for a human, the curved iliac, and it's curved in such a way to where the gluteus medius, the muscle, can attach to the way so it can walk upright comfortably. And there you can see the walking stance is quite different, and therefore the skeleton differences are clear. Other differences as well, chimps and gorillas actually are knuckle walkers, where humans have a hand, and 2 hands and 2 feet, which are designed very differently. And one good example is the top example here is the finger bone they found from Lucy. It is curved. A human finger bone is not curved. And so therefore this is one more evidence that indeed the skeleton of Lucy was of a chimp and not of a human. Now we don't have many examples of this, but from Lucy's species, in fact, they found 1 fragment from Lucy, and so this gives us some indication of the hand bone. And there we can see Homo sapiens, the 4th metatarsal in this case, from Lucy, which is AL 333-160, and then we can see 2 other examples. So we can see the metatarsal from Lucy is much more similar to the other apes that we have shown here. When we look at the primate feet, again, we can see enormous difference. Chimps, gorillas, orangutans, siamang, and a baboon, we have these 5 examples, and then you can see the human there, and you can see the enormous difference. And the chart on the other side, again, shows you more examples of animals, and you can see the difference is quite dramatic. Now, ironically, in trying to understand what bones they found, one study concluded that probably Lucy died falling from a tree. Get my water here. My throat hopefully will hold up. So now how can you tell this? By the bones that they found, judging by that, the breaks that were there, it indicates that Lucy indeed fell from a tree. This obviously is controversial, but it's one theory. And now we can see there's even movies about Lucy, the human chimp, although this focuses on the research that had been done on chimps, but nonetheless, Lucy is mentioned in this film. And that is the end of the presentation. To try to summarize, and I could go on and give you much more evidence, the book that I wrote does do that, but it shows that from the evidence we have, the evidence points out that Lucy was a chimp and not in between a chimp and a man. And why would they conclude this? Well, looking for evidence for human evolution, and as one paleontologist said, this is the best we found. And of course, there are many claims made. All are controversial, including Lucy. In fact, there are a number of very well done paleontological studies that show much more evidence against Lucy as a human chimp link. And so therefore, I conclude from my study, and by the way, there are lots of books that look at human evolution, but most of them are very brief, 300-400 pages. The one that we did was by far the most well documented, and also it is indeed has thousands of references from the peer-reviewed paleontological literature, and so we have produced the best case indeed that shows that all of the claimed missing links are not missing links, but they are simply chimps or close to it. Now, obviously, if you look at a lot of human skeletons, you can find some that have some missing link traits, some chimp traits, especially the skull area. You can find some people that have traits that look like they're chimp-like. And the same thing with chimps. We find differences. But nonetheless, the contrast between the average is so great that we've concluded, indeed, there's no evidence of a link between humans and our putative claimed evolutionary ancestors. And so that's my presentation, which I made it through.
And you did a fantastic job, Dr. Bergman. I appreciate the visuals, and I appreciate all the points. Lots of great points. And we've got a ton of great questions. We've got a great live chat right now, roughly 80 people watching live with a ton of questions just flying in for you pertaining to the topic. So I may as well just jump right into some of these questions then,
Please do.
Dr. Bergman. Okay, so here's a question that has come in, and I can put a lot of them up on screen, like the current ones that have come in, but ones that came in, let's say 20 minutes ago, they may be lost at this point. But here's one from Paleologos. I appreciate the question there, Peter. So the question is for you, obviously, Dr. Bergman, and he asked, does Dr. Bergman believe that Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, is a chimpanzee or simply an ape, a different type of ape unrelated to humans?
Probably a chimpanzee, but again, we just don't have enough body parts. The assumption is she was a chimp because, of course, that's the current theory that we evolved from chimps. But ironically, if you look at the old paleontological literature, the assumption was more commonly we evolved from gorillas, because in many ways we have a lot of traits more in common with gorillas than we do with chimpanzees. But they found there are too many differences between us and gorillas, so the consensus now is that we evolved from chimps. And so that's what the assumption is relative to what Lucy was. But that's a good question. And I think that's one we need to answer, because we need to just conclude, here's the bones, and what are those bones closest to in the paleontological record, and what are they closest to relative to living apes? And I have a feeling you might find they're in some ways closer to gorillas, or orangutans was another guess. Orangutans, gorillas, and chimps are the three common guesses that have been used to claim that we evolved from. Of course, now they don't believe we evolved from chimps. The common explanation is that chimps and humans have a common ancestor, and we evolved from that common ancestor. But that common ancestor was an ape, and so therefore that denies the point. But on the other hand, we don't know what that common ancestor looked like. So all we can do is compare it with modern day chimps and conclude, well, it must have been somewhat like in between a chimp and a human. But hey, great question. I love questions, by the way. When I taught, I had a hard time when the students sat there and took notes. So I always create a controversy, and they asked some questions, and class then became enjoyable for me and for them. So
amen.
Keep the questions coming.
Anybody familiar with this channel and the interactive shows we do, we've always got hundreds of questions coming in. So as you put it right, the evolutionists believe that humans and chimpanzees share a recent common ancestor, maybe between 6 and 10 million years ago. What that common ancestor looks like exactly, no evolutionist really knows, but it would be some type of ape. And one thing I'd like to point out, Dr. Bergman, and get your opinion on it. I find it interesting because the evolutionists will say that the chimpanzee is our closest relative, our closest cousin, right?
They say that now.
And yet we find a break or an inconsistency in their nested hierarchy, because when they sequenced and compared the Y chromosome, which is non-recombining for the most part DNA, it turns out that the human and gorilla Y chromosome is more similar than the human and the chimpanzee Y chromosome, which was kind of a confusion for the evolutionary community. Have you heard about that? And do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up, because maybe they'll realize that, well, maybe we're closer to gorillas than chimps. And I've also looked at the evolution of chimps and gorillas, etc., and found virtually nothing. They can't figure out where in the world gorillas, chimps, and so on themselves evolved from. And so I need to do a paper on that someday. I've got a folder full of articles, and basically what I found is, again, I haven't done an exhaustive study, but what I found is that they have no idea where chimps evolved from, or gorillas evolved from, or any of the other primates evolved. They have guesses and ideas and so on, but by and large, they admit we don't know.
It's funny because I like to dig into the paleoanthropological literature, and I've actually got many books from the evolutionist side just to kind of understand their side better than they do. And a lot of famous paleoanthropologists admit that there's not as much of an incentive in finding, the big transitional forms linking chimpanzees or gorillas. Everybody wants to find that transitional form in the human line. So there's a lack of evidence for what did the chimp evolve from, as you put it, or what did the gorilla evolve from, as you put it, right? Because have you heard of that? And what are your thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, to me that's an excuse in trying to explain the fact that we can't find evidence. If you're a paleontologist, I think any evidence of the evolution of any animal would be useful. And so therefore, we have studies that looked at the evidence of horses from a non-horse, and whales from a non-whale, etc. So any evidence would be useful, but that's true. A lot focus on human evolution because that's of most interest to most paleontologists and most of us.
Amen. Well said. I've got a question here that came in from Faithful, Honest, and True, and the chat is flying. We've got a really great chat. You're a fan favorite, Dr. Bergman, so I appreciate you being here. I do remember essentially what his question was asking, and he's wondering, what are your thoughts on these chimeric species or artificial species, where we have many in the field of paleoanthropology, even admitting that creatures, so-called creatures like Australopithecus sediba or Homo habilis, may actually be the combination of human and ape bones, and therefore not really a species. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's probably a combination of different apes, because I'm not familiar with how apes could interbreed, but we know that, of course, many animals, the best example, of course, is horses, and we can get them to interbreed, and we have zorks and quite a variety of animals that you wouldn't think could interbreed can. Therefore, it's intriguing that they conclude maybe humans did interbreed with chimps. By the way, the experiments have been tried. I did a whole paper on this. One of my books, I published a chapter on this. They try to get apes to interbreed with humans. And ironically, this was done in Africa. And ironically, the scientists who did this concluded that the blacks, the Africans, were closer to an ape than apes were, and therefore they thought they would have the greatest chance of getting a chimera between a chimp or some other ape and humans. And ironically, this was done in a German colony, and the German government said, no way, you're not going to do this. And so back then, of course, they had some different values than they did during Nazi Germany. But so what they did is they lied, and they basically said they were doing just certain examinations on the women, and therefore they attempted to breed by artificial insemination a organism in between a ape and a human, and they failed. They tried and tried, and they failed consistently. And I understand that people are still trying, although today in our society where you're concerned about racism, I would say that's probably not going to go over too well as we would expect it would. But from what I know, I don't think you'll ever get a chimera between apes and humans. It's just there's too many differences.
And what's interesting as well is you have this concept of a false taxon or an artificial species, where something like Australopithecus sediba or Homo habilis, which the evolutionists have, held up and proclaimed as the perfect intermediate. And yet you have many experts in the field of paleoanthropology, specifically dealing with sediba. Two that come to mind are Yoel Rack and Ella Ben. They're not even young Earth creationists. And they've examined the data and said, no, this is not even a real species. This is due to the accidental mixture in the same bone bed, where you've got a human bone here, and then you've got an ape bone here, and they've been mixed together.
That's a very good point. And there are a number of examples. In fact, that is something you always have to be concerned about, especially when you're looking at skeletons, because often these skeletons were consumed by animals, by wolves, and the bones were dragged to various places. So we may find, I think with Lucy, they found the skeleton parts within quite a wide area, quite several hundred feet, evidently. And therefore, you can't even say for sure, although several bones now they've said for sure are not part of Lucy. But on the other hand, it's not easy to determine just because the bones are found in the same area that they're part of the same individual.
Amen. So great response.
Good point.
Great response, Dr. Bergman. So here's another question that comes in from Peter W. I appreciate the question there, Peter W. And he asks, does Dr. Bergman believe Adam and Eve were created, specially created, and therefore were the first humans? And then why?
Yeah, that the evidence is pretty clear from what we know about. One good evidence is indeed that we know that humans are all basically similar. They used to, evolutionists especially, used to look at differences between the races and concluded these were enormous differences. Therefore, humans had several origins. In fact, one theory is that humans evolved from three different type apes, one from the gorillas, one from the chimps, and one from the orangutans. And this was held by a number of researchers for a number of years. Now, of course, we see this as silly. You wonder how in the world people ever concluded this, but nonetheless, they did. And therefore, we realize that, yeah, there are differences, but the differences are fairly small. The data depends on what you look at, because there's a lot of genetic similarities and there's a lot of differences which we find among different people groups. But by and large, you're talking about like 99.1% similarity. So this is why when they do transplants, for example, they're not concerned about race. They're concerned about other factors that are far more important relative to genetic compatibility or other compatibility concerns, histological compatibility concerns. So by and large, they realize that. And this is a problem evolutionists have. And so they have to explain this away by the bottleneck theory. The bottleneck theory is that we're evolving into different groups, and therefore there are different pre-hominid individuals, and something happened. So basically almost all of them are wiped out. So basically we are so similar because all the early pre-humans were wiped out except a small number, maybe 15 or 20 or 30 or 40. And so we are descended from that small number. And so evolutionists would try to explain why in the world we are so similar, why we're not more different. And they explain that by the bottleneck theory. So they're the ones that have the problem trying to deal with this.
Right.
We simply look, of course, at the fact that Adam and Eve fathered the entire human race, and that's why there's so many similarities. Of course, one thing that creationists like to look at is the racism found in evolution. And this is now finally admitted by, in fact, Science Magazine had an article by a paleontologist from Princeton University, and he basically came out and said clearly Charles Darwin was a blatant racist, one of the worst racists in history, and he quoted extensively from his writings. Well, in collecting old biology books, which is one of my hobbies, you find that racism was taught in many, many of the books. They typically show a chimp, and then the word they used, of course, was a Negro, and then modern man, Caucasians. And those pictures were supposed to, in the textbook, prove evolution. Here we have evidence for evolution. A chimp, someone in between the Negroes, and then modern man. And then often the text would occasionally state that humans, the highest race, of course, would be the Caucasians. In fact, the Hunter textbook biology that was in the Scopes trial, it had quite a bit on race, openly stating that the most evolved race was the Caucasians, the white Caucasians. And so clearly, racism was taught in biology textbooks in our country and other countries for decades after decades. And I have a whole PowerPoint on this. I have many, many pictures, and I present this actually in several Black churches. And my wife said, "Don't you dare present that in these churches." And I got such a positive response. They just said, "We're finally recognizing where this racist came from." And a number of people said, "I knew this was true. I knew this was taught, but now I can see it all very clearly." In fact, where I presented this information was at a seminary, and the director of the seminary, after the presentation, he pulled out his wallet, and I knew he was going to give me some money. And I said, "No, you've already given me an honorarium. You've already given me that." And he pulled out a $100 bill, and he gave it to me, and he said, "I want you to take this." No, you take this. And so I took that, and now I have it on my study under glass. I don't plan on spending that money very soon. So to me, that's one of the best compliments you could get when you do a presentation. They give you a $100 bill. You must have really liked it. And indeed, they did, and they found it. And they had a lot of questions, a lot of comments, a lot of dialogue. And so I love to go to various Black churches and seminaries because they are an active audience. They're interested in this. They're typically very intelligent about it, and they realize where a lot of these racist ideas came from. And they find it supportive that indeed it was taught in the textbooks for decades.
Well, that's a fantastic and thorough response, Jerry. It also shows just how dangerous evolutionary theory and that worldview can be. And I love your points about the low genetic variation in humans, because the evolutionary community never predicted the fact that humans worldwide would be so incredibly similar. I mean, we're all 99.999% the same. And from a biblical starting point, God created two people, Adam and Eve. So that would automatically restrict genetic diversity. That makes sense that we'd have low genetic diversity. But as you put it, the evolutionary community had to invent a post hoc out of Africa population bottleneck hypothesis, which doesn't work for so many reasons. So I'm really glad you pointed that out. That's some great points. So the next question I have here, Dr. Bergman, I've got so many, so I'm just kind of looking through them. And I think this is a good one because we hear this argument so frequently, especially from a lot of the professional evolutionists over at ministries like BioLogos, for example. So the question essentially is set up this way. Evolutionists like to look to the so-called chromosome 2 fusion as evidence for ape to man evolution. They purport a fusion of two ape-like chromosomes to explain the differences in human and other primate chromosomes. They will claim that the reputed fusion site contains the expected genetic signs or signal if there really was a fusion. For example, these telomeric repeats. What are your thoughts on this line of argumentation, Jerry?
That's often been presented, and of course, that's what you expect. Is you expect two centromeres, one for each of the original chromosomes. And the reason they look at that, of course, is because apes have one more chromosome than we have, and humans have. And so therefore they expect a fusion to explain the fact that we have one less. And they look for the telomeres, and you expect to find one on each end, of course, and two at the fusion site. Plus you expect to find two centromeres, one on each of the chromosomes. Well, you don't find that. You don't find that at all. What you find in the supposed fusion site is simply a number of genes. A number of them are functional. And then those that they claim are centromeres are not centromeres. And so therefore, the whole idea is demolished. Of course, you can do that by analyzing the chromosomes, the data you have online, and a number of my researchers that I work with did that carefully and found indeed the scientific literature itself showed that that claim is simply false. But a lot of people still want to hold on to that. And I've often said that evolutionists themselves will prove evolution false by their research. And indeed, if you're objective, you just look at the evidence, you're going to find the evidence does not support the evolution idea, and therefore we find, again, in this case, the evidence that scientists found there does not support the evolutionary position. And Jeff Tompkins and I have done several papers on that, thoroughly documenting that indeed that's the case, that there is no fusion site and there's no evidence of evolution by fusion of two chromosomes.
Agreed. Fantastic response. I was just spending a great deal of time last night actually rereading the number of technical articles that you and Dr. Tompkins have put out on that topic. And I find it so fascinating that this so-called reputed fusion site is actually overlapped by a highly functional gene. And the last time I checked, you don't get highly functional genes by slamming together two chromosomes. Typically, that's pretty deleterious, right?
And I find in debating that a lot of evolutionists are not aware of this. I mean, if you study this area, if you look at the data, it's pretty clear. But when you debate evolutionists, they claim, well, there are two fusion sites and there are two telomeres and two telomeres in the center. And so therefore, they're just not aware of it. And so all too often, if they were more aware of the literature, they would not bring up these points, like the 98% I showed in my slide. If you're aware of the data, you know that this is not true. And therefore, problem is we debate a lot of people, evolutionists, who may be scholars in their own field, who look at the evolution of turtles and study that carefully, but they really don't understand or don't have the knowledge of other areas. With that
98%, Dr. Bergman, are they ignoring, for the most part, many gaps, copy number variations, size differences, unalignable regions? Are they accounting for any of these things?
Well, at first, no, because at first it was an estimate. And at first, I think 99%, then they brought it down to 98%. And therefore, they were looking just, what's going on. Now, the problem between comparing chimp and human chromosomes and DNA is that there are so many sections that are uncomparable. What do you do with the uncomparable sections? I mean, you can't compare something that are simply not comparable. So we throw them out. So they simply compare the sections that are comparable. And some of these early numbers came from comparing things that were comparable. Of course, the genes to produce a heart in humans and the genes to produce a heart in chimps are going to be very similar because the hearts are very similar. In fact, they're attempting to transplant, I think they're trying to use pigs now, but they're attempted to transplant a heart from I believe a chimp into a human. This didn't work for a number of reasons, but on the other hand, the design is basically the same. In fact, when you teach biology, we often, since we don't have human cadavers, we often use a heart from a chimp or other animals. And so therefore, you're going to expect a lot of comparison between the parts that are comparable, but you're not going to find comparison, of course, in the parts that are not comparable. So what do you do with that stuff? You just throw it out. And so therefore, when you look at the whole genome and we try to compare even the relevant parts, you still get an enormous amount of difference.
And that makes for a massive waiting time problem, Dr. Bergman, because when you're looking at somewhere between 200 and 400 million DNA differences, well, the question is, how can we fixate, meaning to get stuck in place that many differences in just 6 to 10 million years since the hypothetical split. So that's a great point, Jerry. And the next question that comes in here is from Andrew Cumming. I've got it up on screen, and he asks a question for Dr. Bergman. What do you mean by missing link? And how are you defining it here? I think he's referring back to your presentation.
Yeah, missing link is an interesting term because a lot of these missing links we have in books titled missing links. Well, if you find it, it's no longer a missing link, and therefore the term is outdated. But what we refer to usually in missing link is a link which links us with chimps, an individual which is somewhat in between us and chimps, which has some human traits and some chimp traits. And so that's usually what they're looking for, is these in between, which of course, if you find a link, it's no longer missing. There it is. But the term missing link is still often used because that's what we use it. That's what we refer to. Same as Lucy. Well, I use the term Lucy. Most people do, even though we're not sure if it's a man or woman. Some evidence indicates it's a male, but we use it because, well, people recognize what we mean when we talk about Lucy. When we talk about that than Australopithecus afarensis.
That's a good point. I appreciate the answer there, Dr. Bergman. This next question that comes in here has to do with classification systematics, really, when it comes to fossil specimens. So the question is, Jerry, when looking at a fossil, are there some defining characteristics we can use to tell whether this is human or an ape, or would the evolutionists like to say a non-human ape, since they believe humans are apes, essentially?
Well, yeah, you try to look at things that you know are very different, like the location where the spinal cord goes into the brain, below the occipital area. So you try to find these differences. And this is a good example because this is very dramatically different. Obviously, there are some areas that are very similar. Some of the bones are very similar. The humerus bone is quite similar between humans and apes. So you can't use some of these to make comparisons. So basically what you're trying to do is look at the key differences, and hip bones, of course, are very important. And so there's two or three dozen differences you look at, and therefore you make comparisons based on these, because obviously there's no point in comparing every single bone because there are some that are not that different. And so you have a key factors, about 12 or 14, that they look at to try to make judgments relative to whether a skeleton is an ape, a human, or something in between. Good question, though.
That's a great response, Dr. Bergman. Well, that brings me to this next important question then, and it has to do with these nested hierarchical patterns that evolutionists like to look to. And they will say humans and chimpanzees are more like each other than humans and monkeys or humans and dogs. In other words, the question would come down to, why are we more similar in genetics and anatomy with, let's say, the chimpanzee than with another form of life like a dog or even a lemur?
Well, that's because when you do taxonomy, you're looking for similarities. And if chimps weren't around, if you didn't have any living chimps around, you would still find this nested hierarchy. And even if no apes were around, you could still find evidence of a nested hierarchy that would place us similar to some other animals. I'm not sure what, but on the other hand, you would still find it. But when you look at the variety of life today, it's enormous, and therefore you can group together based on nested hierarchy beliefs. But that doesn't prove anything just because there's a nested hierarchy. That's one way of classifying us, of course, as primates. But then again, so many of the primates look more like squirrels than they do like primates. And so therefore, even that classification is not as useful as ideal. The original classification systems were developed a long time ago, and in the 1700s, and therefore we were stuck with some of those because, well, once we start a system, it's hard to change it. Hard to say, well, all these terms are different. Anatomy, they've done that. There's so many terms that I learned, and all of a sudden they're not used anymore. Like the fallopian tube. That's not the fallopian tube anymore. They call it the uterine tube. Some other term. I find these confusing because so many terms have changed. And I like the old term. And of course, the old term is found in many books, but when you teach anatomy today, you try to use the new terms, but often I just use the old term anyways, because I'm more familiar with that. And then the uterine tube, which probably makes more sense because Dr. Fallopi has been not with us for many, many generations. So he was the one who, of course, discovered some of this and named it. And so kind of nice to name parts after the discoverer. That way they get some recognition for what they've done. And it makes it easier to remember who discovered the fallopian tube. Well, Dr. Fallopi did.
That's an interesting Yeah, that's an interesting point. That's such a fantastic point you made there, Dr. Bergman. When it comes to the evolutionary story and nested hierarchies, if the chimpanzee did not exist, or let's say the chimpanzee and the bonobo, well, they would just say, okay, we're most related to the gorilla. And so we're more similar to the gorilla than we are to a lemur or dog. If the gorilla didn't exist, then we're most similar to an old world monkey or a new world monkey. So regardless, there's always going to be something that humans are most similar to. So it's not really good evidence for common descent. So I'm really glad you made that point. And I'll say this: you gave a fantastic presentation recently on Neanderthals, and I really enjoyed it. And you brought up so many good points. And so this is a good question that comes in here. I've got it up on screen from the Orthodox Moor. And he asks, Dr. Bergman, what is the best explanation for Neanderthal and Homo sapien interbreeding?
I think they interbred without a problem. Neanderthals, of course, were the missing link for, here I'm using that term again, for years. And in fact, many of the books, if they didn't have, quote, Negroes, again, I don't like that term, but that's the term they use. So if they don't have a Negro, they have a Neanderthal. So Neanderthal is commonly shown as a missing link between us and apes. But of course, now we know that if you put a suit on him and comb his hair and have him dress up, he looks just like somebody else walking down the street. And therefore, we know, and the National Geographic did a whole story on this. They did a good job. And they basically pointed out Neanderthals are us. They are simply another group of people, another people group, another race, and they would fit in without a problem, give them an education, put them through American society, and they would blend in without a problem. And of course, we have found people around. I've collected pictures of people who really have very strong Neanderthal traits. And every now and then I see someone who has clearly looks like a Neanderthal, and you dress him up like a Neanderthal and he would fit in the pictures perfectly well. And so therefore, it's a lot of reading into body parts, which like the eyebrows. But when you look at the whole person, etc., brain size, of course, Neanderthals is slightly on the average larger than ours, as far as we know. And therefore, Neanderthals are just another people group that can interbreed without a problem.
That's a great answer, and I highly recommend your presentation on Neanderthals. They were obviously a very sophisticated people group. I mean, they buried their dead, they were into cosmetics, they had purposeful navigation, and we could go on and on and on. So the question is, and I actually watched a recent lecture just a few months ago from not a young earth creationist, a paleoanthropologist who actually made the point that you just made. And he very firmly and adamantly said, Neanderthals are us, just a little different. And he said, flat out that we are the same species and not a separate species. So my question to you then, Jerry, is what's the best explanation for why Neanderthal genetics are slightly different than human genetics? As in, I believe they're about 99.7% rather than the 99.99% similar that we all are.
The best explanation is that when you compare any two people groups, you do find differences because I come from a long line of Germans and Finns, and therefore I have certain characteristics. And when I signed up for 23andMe, they were able to determine how much Finn DNA I had, how much, I had primarily Scandinavian DNA, how much German, and they found a few other groups in my DNA. And so any people group, and of course I'm from a long line of Finns and Germans, and so therefore I have a lot of these traits in common. But they also, when my wife had 23andMe analysis done, she found that she had significant Ashkenazi Jew in her background. And so we're not saying that Jews are genetically different. We're saying that interbreeding, intermixture for centuries has caused similarities to appear. And so therefore, certainly we would expect the same thing with Neanderthals. In fact, when they did my DNA, and a number of people I know, their DNA, I have more Neanderthal DNA than I do a number of other groups. And so indeed, they found some DNA, which is typical of, not a lot, but they found a little bit, which is typical of Neanderthals, and that DNA they found in my genome. And so that's how they can do this. They can trace pretty much what area you came from, not only from Germany, but Western Germany or Northern Germany. Sometimes they can trace you back to a city like Dusseldorf or Hamburg. And of course, if you married people from other areas, then of course they'll find so much Hamburg DNA and so much Dusseldorf DNA and so on. So that's how they can do these experiments. That's how they determine your genealogy. And therefore, you expect the same thing is true with us and Neanderthal. And you'd expect more because, of course, it's been a long time since us and Neanderthals interbred. And so you'd expect more. It hasn't been in my family that long since the Germans and the Finns interbred. And so therefore, I have both DNAs in my system. My father was Finnish and my mother was largely German. So that's the story.
That's another great answer. I appreciate how thorough your answers are to these great questions. And I like to point out to these critics what I believe is the obvious, Dr. Bergman. And that is when it comes to the Neanderthals, they are an extinct people group. They were highly inbred based on the data we now have regarding them. Their rungs of homozygosity were massive. And as you pointed out, they were closer to the flood. They were an example of ancient man, and so they would have already possessed a different set of biodiversity. Why would we expect them to be 99.99% similar to us, given all of these I think data points? So okay, so great points there. I'm looking at these questions, and okay, here's the next one I got. I'll put it up on screen. You talked about the Laetoli footprints, Dr. Bergman, in your presentation, and I've heard evolutionists assert that these footprints, when examined and analyzed, they exhibit a transitional stride that's not quite human and not quite that of an extant ape, like a human or like a chimpanzee or a gorilla. What are your thoughts on that? I would say rescue device to try and say, well, it's not, fully human. It's more of an intermediate. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, if you could just find that they're human-like and ape-like, that would be a finding. But of course, in walking in now, that I'm not sure how it is like to walk in this volcanic ash and how old it was, etc., and whether the conditions, because of course this was found on a layer of topsoil, so they had to remove the topsoil. So you're looking at distortions. In fact, some of these they re-looked at again later, and they found different than what they indicated earlier. And so it's pretty hard to determine much from them, except of course the difference between the major differences between humans and chimps. That's pretty clear. But by and large, some of them look like they only had 2 toes. And so some of them kind of look like an ostrich difference. And so it's hard to judge from footprints that are indeed quite old. And so I'm not sure how you can tell much by the stride. And they only had a few individuals walking around. Maybe they had a foot injury or something. Maybe they been spending so many years of arthritis. There could be a lot of reasons why you get the data that you got.
Well, right there is the perfect response, Dr. Bergman, because I've interacted with a lot of these militant critics, and the Laetoli footprints demonstrate what? That anatomically modern looking humans must have been around at that point. And according to the evolutionary model, that could not have been the case because this was essentially millions of years ago. They have this circular line of reasoning. And so they've said, well, the stride is intermediate. But like you pointed out, I mean, walking through those conditions, or if you were to check my stride at the beginning of the day, and then let's say I went to work for 12 hours and then tested my stride at the end of the day, you're probably going to find some variations there. So I don't find that to be a good argument or criticism. So here's the next question that comes in, and I'm trying to find it. We got 100 people live right now watching Dr. Bergman. So fantastic information you're providing us. And this one comes in from Paleo Logos. This one looks like it's a little bit specific, and he's asking about your thoughts. If you've looked at, this is a newer finding when it comes to, I think the technical name is Australopithecus prometheus, if I'm correct, on Littlefoot. And he's asking, what are your thoughts on some of the foot bones that were found? He's saying these indicate that Australopithecines had a big toe that was not as divergent as chimps. Have you done any research into this specific finding, Dr. Bergman?
Exactly. The footprints that we have were worn down, and so therefore you only get the bottom of the foot. You don't get a lot of details about other parts of the foot, and therefore that's the difference. Also, I should notice that I'm not sure why, but I walk on my sides for some reason. I know that because of the wear on my shoes. If you look at your shoes, it tends to wear not equally across the whole shoe, but more on one side than on the other side. And so that's an individual trait. And of course, whenever you have an N of 1, it's very hard to make conclusions. You need a good sample. You need several hundred footprints to make indeed a good determinations. And I find they're so anxious to read all kinds of things into what they find that you have to be somewhat skeptical. And that's one thing that paleontologists criticize other paleontologists for, is they say, yeah, you see a lot of evidence and merit with this trait, but I don't. And so therefore they de-emphasize it.
I appreciate that response, Dr. Bergman. I got a couple people in the chat asking, it looks like there's some scratching noise or something possibly coming in on your end. That is okay, but it was kind of,
Yeah, that's my dog.
it's kind of hard to hear you. Okay, it's your dog. No worries. It kind of drowned out your answer a bit. No worries at all.
My dog wants to get on TV with you guys.
Yeah, he wants to be famous. We can get him in.
He's a cute. Yeah. Everywhere we go, people say, "What a cute dog."
Man's best friend. Now, is he a young Earth creationist at least? He's not an
course.
Okay, so here's the next question that comes in. This one's from Andrew Cumming, and short and sweet. He's asking, have you heard of Ardipithecus ramidus? And essentially, would you say Ardi is good evidence for evolution?
Ardi is one of the worst examples that I've seen, and there's a lot of research done, even by paleontologists, that point out that Ardi is a big problem. And I don't have the data in front of me, but I know there are several studies that I've read that claim that this is pretty weak evidence for evolution. I didn't write the chapter on Ardi in my book, by the way, so that would be Peter Line's research. So he looked at that.
Well, thank you for that response, Jerry. As we start to wind down here, because I did just look at the clock, and time flies by with you. You are a wealth of information, and I really hope we can have you on again in the future, because again, you're clearly a fan favorite. We've had roughly 100 people engaging in this conversation in the live chat. So let's kind of wind it down here with the last couple questions that came in, and this one comes in from Chris Peacock, and he asks, if we are made in the image of God, why are we more bacteria than human?
Because bacteria are so incredibly small. Yeah, statistically, you find that we're in 90% bacteria, but they're so incredibly small, and there's so many of them that, yeah, in many ways we are more bacteria, but those bacteria serve very important roles. And we didn't understand that until recently, that indeed bacteria are necessary for good health, and that's called probiotics. In fact, they found some studies are that we have too many of the wrong bacteria, and therefore we need more of the right bacteria that will take up the room of the wrong bacteria. And so the numbers, of course, doesn't mean much, of course, when you look at the number of cells. But yeah, I've heard these. I saw it when I taught microbiology. They said we're 90% bacteria and 10% people, but I'm not sure how accurate those numbers are. But those are things that are thrown around in microbiology for years.
That's a great response. I find that when people hear about bacteria or even viruses, they tend to think of something that's bad, when in fact, both bacteria and viruses, you wouldn't want to live in a world without bacteria and viruses. They're essential and oftentimes necessary to sustain healthy life processes in the cell. So it's not a good assumption to automatically think, okay, bacteria means something bad. And the same goes for viruses. So
the vast majority of both are beneficial.
Amen. And you know what? To make this just an absolute complete dismantling of human evolution, I've really enjoyed this. This has been great. And I want to get this one in here because one of their go-to lines of evidence, again, especially with the professional evolutionists, they'll say, well, humans and chimpanzees share genetic mistakes or pseudogenes or, junk DNA sequences. And therefore, they'll say we must have inherited those genetic mistakes from a common ancestor. Do you find this to be a good line of argumentation?
No, because a lot of these so-called mistakes we find are not mistakes, number one. And number two, we find there's going to be similarities and mistakes because there's similarities in the genes, and there's what they call hotspots. And hotspots means that you have mutations in certain areas. And so you can compare genes from humans and chimps and find the hotspots in both and find mutations occur at the same place in both. And that's why we have research studies. They look at cancer not only among people, but among animals, and they find similar hotspots and therefore similar genetic areas between the two. And so now I know that a number of researchers try to claim this as evidence for evolution. It's like you have a mistake, the example they give is a mistake in a paper. And if I copy that paper, plagiarize it from you, and then I have the same mistake. And of course, that would prove that my paper actually came from your paper. And that's why the mistakes are the same in both papers. And that seems logical when you're talking about mistakes in papers, but by and large, that has not held up very well. Although it's been popular for a few years, but that hasn't held up very well in the scientific literature because they realize these so-called mistakes do not necessarily show a common ancestor. What they show is commonality in the genome because of hotspots.
Amen. I completely agree. So is this, in your opinion, because I know you've done a lot of work on vestigial organs, is this kind of like the new take on vestigial organs? And they know that those have been overturned for the most part. So now they're looking to vestigial genes. And now we know a lot of those are functional as well.
Yeah, that when an argument is shown wrong, one way of resurrecting it is finding similarities. And of course, the vestigial argument, which was one time over 100 vestigial organs, but now there are no confirmed examples of vestigial organs in the human body and in other bodies as well, as far as we know. And so therefore, the argument was a good argument. I mean, how could you claim that God created us and put all this junk in our body, all these organs that don't work? That indicates evolution because we evolved from organisms that these things did work. And so for that doesn't support creation because God would not make bodies with all these mistakes, these useless organs in it. So it's a good argument. It worked for quite a while, but now that we know that all these organs that are were vestigial, are not vestigial. And therefore they try to find some other argument. So they look at vestigial genes. And so this is the next popular argument. So evolutionists, of course, have to constantly chase the claims because once they're refuted, they've got to come on to something else. And when you see the world through evolutionary glasses, you're looking for evidence of evolution. And if you look hard enough, I guess you find it. And they do. And that gives me something to do to write another paper proving their arguments are wrong.
Amen. And I love your papers and articles. I spend a great amount of time reading through them and studying them. How would you respond to an evolutionist who would say this in response to the vestigial organ counter argument from a creationist? They'll say, well, we never predicted that these vestigial organs would have no function. It's that they would have either a reduced function or maybe have adopted a novel or different function.
Yeah, well, that's a common argument used now to avoid embarrassment. But actually, they did use the claim, and this in the literature, they did use the claim that these don't have any function. That not only has no function, but also has a problem, causes disease like the appendix. And so they can claim, well, the appendix doesn't have the function it used to have, and so therefore it is still vestigial. But by and large, the word vestigial does not mean a different function or less important function. It simply means it's a remnant of what used to be and has no function or almost no function. And so it's a way of trying to avoid the embarrassment of claiming that indeed they still exist. So yeah, that's commonly used, but that's, and in my books, I don't claim that they always claim they had no function. I often claim they had less function, and I try to prove indeed they don't have less function, but they have an equal, if not more important function than the organs did in the past.
Amen. Amen. Well said. They've had to redefine what a vestigial organ or structure is after they were shown, unfortunately, to be completely wrong and in error on that. This one comes in the form of a super chat, or a donation is what we call it here. Logical, plausible, probable. And he's asking, do you have copyright control of your books? If so, would you be interested in having some audiobooks created? So it looks like we're dealing with somebody who is interested in turning some of your books into an audiobook.
Some of them do, I believe, but I'm not sure because the publisher takes care of all this. They determine a lot of what the book goes online, when it goes online, whether it's a Kindle edition, whether it's an audio, etc. And I'm really not sure. As far as I know, there are none, but of course I have copyright control. So therefore, if someone is interested in making audiobooks, fine, I'll be glad to cooperate. Just contact me, care of you. Be fine.
Awesome. I appreciate, especially nowadays, people are doing a lot of traveling. They're on the road a lot. It's always helpful and convenient to listen rather than read. And I guess here's my final question, and then we'll wrap it up. I really appreciate you giving me an hour and a half of your time, Dr. Bergman. This has been a real blessing. We now have over 100 people in the live chat. So again, you're well respected, and your answers, your thorough answers, I really appreciate them. This is kind of related to the junk DNA argument again, because now evolutionists will say, well, we have these endogenous retroviruses that are shared between humans and chimpanzees. And they'll say that these are the ancient remnants of past viral infections that have been passed down. But from my study, I've discovered paper upon paper now showing that these endogenous retroviral-like elements are actually functional. They're functional in the embryo. They're functional in gene expression, determining cell types. They actually act as antiviral protectors, which is interesting. So would you hold to the same argument then that these shared endogenous retroviral sequences are derived from this faulty junk DNA assumption?
Yeah, I would concur with you that indeed they're finding more and more of these do have a function, and that they're not just junk DNA that got in there because of an infection in the past. But you would expect that some viruses, of course, have similarity between our genes, because a virus can get in your cells and it's got the equipment to read your cell and use its genes using your cellular equipment to make copies of itself. So you're going to find some similarities. But on the other hand, the DNA is so enormous. You have so many miles and miles of DNA. You're going to find some differences if you look, and you'll find some similarities likewise if you look. And so therefore, they look a lot, they find some similarities. And of course, because there are similarities, doesn't it all mean that indeed we got that from a viral infection that occurred when we were still apes? So that's to me, that's a very specious argument. But when you're scraping the bottom of the barrel, you kind of have to find what you can.
And it's funny because they want to avoid the massive differences, like going back, 45 minutes ago when we were talking about the Y chromosome, which when you consider overall size differences, architecture, and gene content, Dr. Bergman, you're looking at a Y chromosome that's really only about 35% the same between humans and chimpanzees. How do they account for those massive differences? I'd like to know.
A lot of evolution. There's much
a
evolution
lot of
between.
Hyperevolution is what they'll say in their technical papers. And that is a code for we don't know.
Yeah.
Well, here we go. Great chat. Great presentation. I want to encourage people in the audience to please share this around. We've had a really, really great audience with so many fantastic questions. Dr. Bergman, I really appreciate your time. I know how busy you are. You really are a blessing and a warrior in the world of creation versus evolution. So I want to hand it to you for some final thoughts, final words, and thank you again for doing this.
Okay, thank you. And check on Amazon. All my books are on Amazon. Also, there's a website, Evo, Creation Evolution, which I have about 230 articles on now. So if you look under my name, Creation Evolution, and my name, you will find the website. On David Coppedge is the director of it, Coppedge. So if you type his name in, you'll get a lot of information. And Creation Safari is another website that I have a lot of work on. And so it's there. So it's nice to know when people read my books and get on my website. And because you wonder, I work so hard writing these books, and I wonder how many people read them.
Well, I can tell
people do.
I can tell you a lot because we're going on an hour and a half and we still have 105 people here live, really enjoying this content. And this was very thorough. I'm really, really happy with this. We dealt with, their best so-called icons. We dealt with pseudogenes, chromosome 2 fusion, endogenous retroviruses, nested hierarchies. So in my opinion, that means evolution dismantled. And essentially it's time to convert. Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ. So again, I appreciate those final words, Dr. Bergman. To the audience, thank you so much for tuning in. This has been a ton of fun. And thank you so much for being just so engaged in tonight's conversation. Standing for Truth is out. God bless all.